Herzlich willkommen zu diesem Vortragsabend, der mit dem Brexit eine hochaktuelle politische Entwicklung zum Thema hat. Events are unfolding as we speak. Mit der gerade erst vorgestern erfolgten Ankündigung von Neuwahlen hat die Geschichte noch einmal an Brisanz gewonnen. Umso mehr bin ich gespannt auf die heutige Diskussion. Und ja, die Ergebnisse des Referendums vom 23. Juni vergangenen Jahres kamen für viele überraschend. Aber vielleicht hätte man es doch ahnen können. Denn ganz so überraschend erscheinen sie gar nicht, wenn man sich die Geschichte des Verhältnisses zwischen dem Vereinigten Königreich und dem europäischen Integrationsprojekt vor Augen führt. Wenn man nun diese Ergebnisse kleinräumig analysiert, lassen sich auch noch andere Gründe für das Abstimmungsverhalten der Briten erahnen. Zumindest dort, wo die Mehrheitsverhältnisse am deutlichsten sind. Gründe, die für und auch gegen den Brexit sprechen. So gibt es zum Beispiel mittel- bis langfristige Entwicklungen, wie etwa den Grad der wirtschaftlichen Verflechtung mit dem Binnenmarkt. Das erklärt neben anderen Faktoren zum Beispiel das Londoner Ergebnis gegen den Brexit. Ganz deutlich wird der Effekt von Verflechtung aber in dem Stimmbezirk mit dem höchsten Stimmenanteil gegen den Brexit. Gibraltar mit 96% der Stimmen für einen Verbleib in der EU. Es gibt aber auch gegenläufige, jüngere, recht kurzfristige Entwicklungen, wie zum Beispiel die Einwanderung von EU-Ausländern. Der Stimmbezirk mit dem höchsten Anteil für den Brexit war die kleine Stadt Boston in den East Midlands, die im vergangenen Jahrzehnt eine ungewöhnlich hohe Zahl von Immigranten, vornehmlich aus Polen, Litauen und Lettland, verzeichnet hat. Mit der Folge, dass der Durchschnittslohn für niedrig qualifizierte Arbeitnehmer um 30% unter den landesweiten Durchschnitt gefallen ist, während die Preise vor allem für Wohnraum stark angezogen haben. Hier haben 75,6% für den Brexit votiert. Auch über diese Entwicklung wird unser Referent berichten und ich freue mich sehr, dass er unserer Einladung gefolgt ist und dass auch er so viel Geduld in meinem Auto hatte. Professor Piers Ludlow, herzlich willkommen. Zu seiner Person möchte ich gar nicht viel sagen, denn eingehender vorstellen wird ihn gleich der Gesprächsleiter des heutigen Abends. Deshalb an dieser Stelle nur so viel. Piers Ludlow forscht und lehrt an der London School of Economics. Die LSE liegt im Borough of Westminster, das sich im Referendum mit 69% der Stimmen gegen den Brexit entschieden hat. Was natürlich rein gar nichts über die persönliche Haltung unseres Referenten aussagt. Mehr über Piers Ludlow erfahren Sie nun von Dr. Nikolai von Ondarza, bei dem ich mich ganz herzlich bedanken möchte dafür, dass er sich bereit erklärt hat, heute Abend die Gesprächsleitung zu übernehmen. Als stellvertretender Leiter der Forschungsgruppe EU-Europa an der Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik ist er dafür außerordentlich qualifiziert. Und ich bin jetzt schon sehr gespannt darauf, ob und wie sich die politikwissenschaftliche und die historische Perspektive ergänzen oder vielleicht auch widersprechen mögen. Nikolai von Ondarzas Forschungen berühren Grundsatzfragen der europäischen Integration, insbesondere die gemeinsame Sicherheits- und Verteidigungspolitik und die Auswirkungen der europäischen Schuldenkrise. Daneben galt und gilt sein Interesse aber auch ganz besonders der britischen Europapolitik. Und das schon seit längerem, lange bevor der Brexit zu einem tagespolitischen Thema geworden ist. Das hängt wohl auch damit zusammen, dass Herr von Ondarza vor 10 Jahren ein Mastersprogramm in Contemporary European Studies absolviert hat, das ihn zu Studien an die Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, an die Karls-Universität Prag und nicht zuletzt an die University of Bath geführt hat. Der District Bath von North East Somerset hat übrigens mit 58% gegen den Brexit gestimmt, was natürlich rein gar nichts über die persönliche Haltung unseres Gesprächsleiters aussagt. Ich freue mich auf den Vortrag und die anschließende Diskussion mit Ihnen allen. Zunächst aber hat Herr von Ondarza das Wort. Bitte schön.
Ja, auch auch von meiner Seite herzlichen Dank für die Einladung und auch für die Geduld. I think I will switch to English now, as the presentation from our guest will be in English, and it's easier to lead the discussion just in one language so that we don't switch back and forth. But I thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I think you pointed to one very important aspect, the interlinkage of different scientific views on Brexit. And I come from political science, and as you can imagine, contemporary events like just the recent announcement of the general elections are turning us here and they are looking here, and they are always following the current events. And the European Parliament Research Service just recently made an overview of European think tank papers and political science papers on Brexit. And it was 50 pages, just short abstracts on Brexit papers. So you can see just in the last months, 9 months, there were countless and countless papers from political scientists, economists, lawyers published on Brexit. But I think what we sometimes forget is the historical perspective, and that it's not just been the short referendum campaign that has colored Britain's view on the European Union, but that it's been an over 40 years relationship. And I think with Professor Piers Ludlow, we have one of the best historians from the United Kingdom on the long and sometimes difficult, often with a critical but still close attachment to the European Union relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU. And therefore I'm very happy and very interested to hear his presentation today and discuss with you his insights on how the difficult relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom developed, what we can possibly learn from that, and then in the discussion maybe also look into the future. And I think due to the time constraint, without much further ado, I give the floor to you and look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody for waiting. It's not a case of fog in the Channel on this occasion, but traffic jams on the Berlin Ring Road. But the British were late, as often before. Okay, so let me start off by saying what I won't be doing, although I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion. Namely, I'm not going to be talking about where we are now and still less about where we go from here. I'm interested in both, and I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion, but I'll be doing so in a sense as a British citizen, as somebody who's interested in European affairs, and sometimes someone who's therefore interested in the position we're currently in. But I wouldn't claim any real expertise. What I think I can bring to the party, by contrast, is a sense of historical perspective and some sense of how we got to where we are now. And so my talk is very much a historian's attempt to come to terms with last year's referendum result and to try and explain why the 45-year marriage or so between Britain and the European Union looks as if it is going to end in the divorce courts. So it's a historian's attempt to, in a sense, come to terms with where we are now rather than a political scientist's take on the current position. Now, I think it's very tempting when you deal with the question of Britain and Europe to come up with a very glib answer about why the British are now in the position that they currently are. In other words, they're having just triggered Article 50 and begun, in effect, divorce proceedings. And it's very easy to come up with an answer which centres on the difficulties that Britain has had with the European integration process from the very outset. And so in the first part of my talk, I want very briefly to go through that sort of legacy of long-standing difficulties and just remind you of the extent to which this has been a difficult relationship from the very beginning. But I'm then going to go on to complicate it and say I don't necessarily think those difficulties were bound to have ended in the divorce courts. I think you needed some shorter-term changes as well in order to explain how Brexit came about. But the easy answer is to say this was always a difficult marriage. The British, after all, did not initially join the integration process. It wasn't just your British speaker who was late, but the British themselves were late in joining the integration process, refusing to join in 1950, refusing to join again in 1955, and then spending the rather difficult, frustrating, and even humiliating period of the 1960s trying to get into the European community, but finding the road to Brussels barred by the imposing figure of General de Gaulle. Another aspect of the sort of bumpy marriage that is worth briefly recalling is the terrible timing of Britain's arrival in the European community. 1973, the year the British joined, was of course not just the year of the first enlargement, it was also the end of the post-war economic boom and the start of the 1970s economic downturn. And the result of this unfortunate coincidence of timing was that whereas the founding 6 members of the European community had 20 years of economic prosperity, which created a kind of bond in people's mind between European integration and economic success, whether or not there was a causal link, I don't want to discuss here, but that was the impression created. For the British, and of course the Danes and the Irish, the experience was almost totally the reverse. No sooner had they joined than the economy seemed to hit a period of long-standing decline, and that too coloured the British experience. But throughout the subsequent 4 decades of Britain's membership, there have been a succession of unhappy and difficult crises, which I'll briefly touch upon now. So during the 1970s itself, you had the first renegotiation and the 1975 referendum, one which had a very different outcome to that of 2016, but nevertheless the fact that the British are the only country to have had 2 in-out referendums is, I think, revealing. At the end of the 1970s, you have the British decision to opt out of the European monetary system, possibly the most sort of ambitious policy initiative of that decade. In the early 1980s, you had the row over the British budgetary contribution and Mrs. Thatcher's angry tirades to get her money back. In 1983, it's worth remembering, the Labour Party fought the general election of that year on a manifesto pledge to take Britain out of the European community. It lost by a long, long way, but nevertheless the fact that the major opposition party was running on those lines was in itself revealing. Then in the mid-1980s, although Mrs. Thatcher was in favour of certain aspects of the single market project, she tried very hard to block the convening of the Intergovernmental Conference, which would eventually lead to the Single European Act, and had to be outvoted at the Milan Summit in 1985. Towards the end of that decade, you then have the long rows over EMU and Mrs. Thatcher's vain attempts to block the single currency project. Then, of course, nobody in this country needs to be reminded of Mrs. Thatcher's position on German unification and the difficulties that that caused. The Maastricht Treaty, this is, of course, after Mrs. Thatcher has gone, was a further demonstration of Britain's difficult position, in as much as while Major was able to come out of the negotiations claiming that it was game, set and match to Britain, he was clearly watching a different tennis match to everybody else. The successes about which he boasted were primarily successes of opting out. In other words, the whole succession of British opt-outs, notably over the single currency and the social charter. You then have the agonizing rows over the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty that dominated British domestic politics throughout much of John Major's prime ministership in the 1990s. The actions of the bastards, the Eurosceptics of the period, were a huge problem for his leadership. But then you also have on top of that the row over mad cows, BSC, from the mid-1990s. I still have vivid memories of an Oxford conference at that period, which my supervisor organised, where she served beef, and I have never seen so many people become vegetarians in a hurry as at that meal. Then, of course, you have the British decision not to join the single currency in the late 1990s, early years of this century. rows between old Europe and new Europe over the Iraq War, the way in which the British played a really rather backmarker and negative line during most of the negotiation over the abortive European Constitution, and then finally and most recently Cameron's sniping at both the Eurozone attempts to solve the Eurozone crisis, but also his non-cooperative policy towards the migration crisis and refugee policy. So in other words, you have here a story of a Britain that throughout the 4 decades of its community membership has never been a particularly happy member state and has always been seemingly having one row or another with its partners and with Brussels. So I think you can point to this regular pattern of difficulty to emphasize the fact that this has been a problematic marriage. I think you can also point to a number of features of the British debate about Europe that again have underlined how difficult and problematic this has been from the outset. British public opinion on Europe has been relatively volatile, but I think the one constant that you can say about it is that European integration has never enjoyed the kind of reservoir of positive support that initially, at least, used to be the case in most of the founding member states. It may have changed now, but for most of the countries of the Six and some of the other late arrivals, there was a generally positive viewpoint, even if it didn't necessarily go with approval of everything that Brussels did. In Britain, that was never there. You also have had in Britain a very aggressive and, over the last 2 decades at least, increasingly hostile press with regard to Europe. Terrible run of turnouts in the European parliamentary elections. The British had the lowest turnout in the 1979 election. I think they've had the lowest turnout in every single parliamentary election until they leave. And an underlying link throughout the process, and I think this is true in the beginning, but it's also true in the middle and the end, that alternative marriages, alternative partnerships were possible. At the beginning, the most talked about alternative was the Commonwealth, the idea that the Commonwealth should be our trading partners rather than Europe. But politically, the alternative tended to be the special relationship with the United States. More recently, the American issue has remained constant. The Commonwealth has faded slightly, but one of the interesting factors in the last 10 to 15 years is that it has kind of re-emerged in a new guise, and you get discussion about the Anglosphere and the idea of sort of the English-speaking nations linking up in one way or another. And if you talk to an ardent Brexiteer, it's quite likely that that's the sort of fantasy that they will spin. And I think it's also worth stressing another feature about this problematic relationship from the beginning, that the British never obtained that leadership position within the European community that was taken for granted by those British political leaders that wanted to join. If you look at Harold Macmillan, if you look at Harold Wilson, if you look at Edward Heath, the one thing that they absolutely took for granted was that once Britain was in, it would become, if not the leader, at least one of the leaders of the European integration process. And partly because of this succession of crises, the British have actually never felt that they have been able to reach that role. Europe has gone on being something that is dominated by others, initially by the French, then by the French and the Germans, latterly by the Germans alone. But the British have never quite felt that they were at the steering wheel of the bus or the boat or the ship or whatever you want, so whichever metaphor you want to do. It's always been something led by others. And I think that has created a very different attitude at all sorts of levels. And Cameron's refusal to turn up at the ceremony in Oslo when the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, speaks volumes in that respect. This was not something the British could take pride in, that this was the EU was being given this prize. Instead, the British just stood back and scoffed, and they sent some junior diplomat rather than their prime minister when everybody else went and picked up the prize. And I think that kind of lack of pride in the process was quite revealing. So I think there is something there in this kind of unhappy marriage from the start story. But as I said at the beginning, I don't think that's enough. I don't think it's enough just simply to say that this was a bad marriage from the start, it was always on the rocks, and therefore the fact that after 40 years it has ended in the divorce court should come as no surprise. I don't think that's quite sufficient, because I think that interpretation leaves out as much as it includes. And so while I'm not rejecting what I've just said, and while I'm not denying the difficulties that have persisted in the Britain and European relationship, I think it's important to sort of turn away from that for a second and recall that this has actually also been a relationship which has had a number of notable successes, and it's to those that I want to turn in the second part of my talk. Now, I think the first success, or the first aspect that is left out in this awkward partner hypothesis, the idea that this was a marriage that was in trouble from the start, is the way in which the British have actually, despite what I just said about leadership, been able to play a rather significant role at European level. Now, I think it is true that relatively few British prime ministers have ever become the heavyweight figures at European Council level that their German and French counterparts have been. There are various reasons for that which we could perhaps discuss, but I don't think it's very difficult to think of a single British prime minister who has really been the dominant figure at European Council level, whereas there are several French presidents and several German chancellors of whom you can certainly say that. But I think if one looks slightly below the European Council level, the picture changes somewhat. And there have been a succession of British ministers who have been very important players in their respective councils, a large number of British civil servants who have been crucial players within the various civil service and other committees that discuss European policy matters, and indeed the British were often both prized as allies in many of the discussions in Brussels, but also feared as opponents. And there have been a good number of effective and constructive British commissioners: Christopher Soames, Arthur Cofield, Leon Britton, Chris Patten, to name but a few. One fairly decent president, Roy Jenkins, about whom I've written a book, and a decent number of good senior British fonctionnaires. It's true that the British struggled initially to recruit the right number of people to get to Brussels, and so they struggled in the early years, and it's also true that in the last decade and a half they've struggled again. But in between, in the kind of middle phase of British EU membership, there were a lot of extremely good Brits around Brussels who played their roles extremely well. Furthermore, if one looks beyond personalities and one thinks of policies, I think it's fairly clear that over the last 4 decades, a good number of British policy priorities have been realised at Brussels level. The most obvious of these is clearly the single market. Now, it's not just a British project. There were many others who wanted a single market, but nevertheless the British were strongly in favour of it, and the fact that it has been realised along the lines that the British wanted, I think, partly speaks to the idea that the British have been influential players in Brussels. Ditto enlargement. The British were always very strong advocates of the enlargement of the EU, and the fact that we are talking about a Europe of the 28, albeit soon to become Europe of the 27, I think is partly down to British influence and support. But there have been other policy areas too where I think you can point to a significant British role. So, for instance, the institutionalising of regular consultations with the US and the development of mechanisms to try and avoid a situation where European foreign policy coordination was at cross purposes with Washington. That was something the British were very keen of and has to a large extent happened. Various European institutions have borrowed British procedures quite profitably. For instance, the European Parliament borrowed question time from Westminster, and still will use that even once the British have left. And even the plethora of British opt-outs that I mentioned before and that have become such a feature of Britain's recent trajectory within the European Community Union are in many ways a testament to influence. You need to sort of earn an opt-out. You can't just ask for it. You have to win it in negotiations. And the fact that the British were able to secure such opt-outs is, in a sort of strange backhanded sort of way, an indication of their influence and capacity to play the game. So while the picture is patchy, I do have quite a lot of time for the statistics that some of my more quantitatively minded political science colleagues come up with, which tend to show that if you analyse voting patterns within the Council of Ministers or whatever over a long period of time, the British are more often than not voting on this with the majority rather than against. This has not been one where it's constantly been 27 versus the British. On the contrary, there have been some issues where they have lost out, but by and large they have tended to be going with the flow rather than against it. Britain has not, in other words, been a uniformly awkward partner, unable to play the Brussels game in a successful manner. On the contrary, it has often played this game extremely effectively and well, and it's secured a good number of its desired outcomes in the process. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why Brexit is regarded with such concern by so many of Britain's erstwhile partners, precisely because the Germans, the Danes, the Irish, the Swedes, etc., have often liked to think the British would naturally be on their side in arguments in Brussels and are worried about the future when that will no longer be the case. So at the level of Britain's participation, the story is actually much more mixed than the awkward partner hypothesis in its simplest form would imply. Second thing which I think is left out by the simple awkward partner hypothesis is Britain's economic success within the EU. Now, you can play endless games of British economic performance, and you can poke holes in it, you can point to the abysmal productivity and all sorts of other things, and I'm not an economist and I'm not going to go into details about that here, and I'm probably not qualified to do so. But I think it is probably beyond dispute that the British economy of today is in a vastly different position from the problem child that it was when it went into the community in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the British fully deserved the tag of the sick man of Europe economically. That is no longer the case. And while that is certainly not wholly attributable to European integration, and quite a lot of it is to do with domestic reform and things that have happened within Britain, and some of it has happened, and some of it has to do with the broader changes in the global economy, quite a lot of that success has been attributable to Britain's successful use of the single market opportunities and the way in which it has used the sort of competitive environment of the European single market to generate and to stimulate its own industry. It has also benefited immensely from large amounts of inward investment, most famously, of course, the Japanese car firms that build Nissans in Sunderland, etc., 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 and large numbers of multinational companies have chosen to base themselves in Britain. It has also benefited, despite the societal controversy about this, from inward migration, etc., etc., etc. So I think, although during the referendum campaign there was a great deal of controversy about the exact economic effects, and it's also the case that the referendum campaign was fought in a period where, because of the recent Eurozone crisis, it was possible for some of those in favour of Brexit to argue that the European economy was holding Britain back rather than pushing Britain forward. I think if you pan out at all and look at a slightly longer slice of time, it's almost beyond dispute that European economic integration has been beneficial for the British economy over the last 20 or 30 years, and therefore what will happen once it ceases to be is not probably something that I enjoy thinking about. So the economic picture has been a lot more successful than the awkward partner hypothesis would imply. A third omission, I think, is the degree to which the British have actually become culturally more European over the last 30 to 40 years. Now, this is a difficult area, and it's one where it's very difficult to disentangle Europeanization from globalization and Americanization and other things that have been going on at the same time. But I think anybody who has been in Britain recently would, I think, observe that the way in which where we take our holidays, how we greet one another, how our teams play football, and indeed who they play against, and even to some extent what we watch on television, think of Scandinavian crime dramas, have all been influenced by closer ties with Europe. And indeed, I think one of the interesting things about the post-referendum angst that we're now going through is precisely the way in which for the 47% who lost out, this has been a period of, in a sense, almost discovering how European we are, and this has been a real surprise to many to suddenly contemplate what we might be about to lose and to realize that this is actually something that we've come to take for granted. And then finally, I also think that the awkward partner hypothesis ignores the fact that for most of Britain's 40 plus years as an EU member state, Euroscepticism has actually been a very bad vote winner in electoral terms. It was always the case that there was enough scepticism amongst the British political class, but also amongst the British general public, for it to be tempting for ambitious politicians to play the Eurosceptic card. And throughout those 40 years of history, there have been a number of ambitious politicians, from Enoch Powell and Tony Benn through to Norman Lamont and Norman Tebbit in somewhat more recent times, and then through to the current Brexiteers, who have attempted to play the Eurosceptic card. But it is equally the case that until UKIP's recent success, and that does look as if it's going to be a very transitional success if the current opinion polls are anything to be to go by, the general lesson about certainly general election outcomes was that Euroscepticism played very badly. Labour in 1983 went down to one of the biggest defeats of its history. Now, of course, it wasn't just about Europe. This was also a party that was standing on a platform of unilateral nuclear disarmament and lots of controversial economic things as well. So it was far from just Europe, but it did not give you a good example of the way in which you won votes through being Eurosceptic. The Conservatives, during their period when they were turning anti-European in the 1990s and the first years of this century, repeatedly lost heavily to Tony Blair, and James Goldsmith's attempts in the 1990s to launch the Referendum Party were equally unsuccessful. Now, I don't think this reflected the fact that the British public was fundamentally pro-European, but I think it does reflect the fact that most of the British public was not actually very interested in Europe. The one thing that came out consistently in opinion polls was that this was not the most important issue for most people, and not therefore what swung their vote in European elections. And they therefore tended to react to the sort of Europhobes, those who were most hostile to Europe, in much the same way that they reacted to the Euro fanatics, by thinking they were talking about something that was just very boring, very uninteresting, and they really didn't care very much. And they therefore, in a sense, took a referendum where, in a sense, they had no choice but to talk about Europe to get the British public to actually concentrate sufficiently on the European issue. And even then, one of the persistent features of the campaign, and I can sort of, as somebody who lived through it last year, was how much time people spent saying how bloody boring it was. So it was impossible to turn on the television without hearing somebody saying, "Oh God, they're talking about Europe again." And there was this sort of sense that this was an issue that we really would much rather not be talking about. So I think this kind of fundamental dislike of talking about Europe persisted even during the referendum campaign. So, where does all this leave us? If it's not so obviously the case that the British were on a kind of fast track to divorce from the beginning, that this was always a doomed marriage, how do we explain what happened last year? How do we explain the fact that we are now seemingly going to be going our separate ways? Well, there are, I think, three shorter-term factors that I want to point to in the last part of my talk, which I think help explain why this fragile but nevertheless potentially lasting marriage was ultimately defeated in 2016. Now, the first of these shorter-term factors, although it's not a short-term factor because I am talking about a 20-year-plus transformation, is the switch in the position of the Conservative Party from the party of Harold Macmillan and Edward Heath, the party that used to style itself as the Party of Europe, the pro-European party in British politics, to what I think can now be fairly accurately described as a fundamentally Eurosceptic, almost Europhobic party. Now, quite how this transformation happened is something that I want to probe much more in detail as I begin to work on the big book I plan to write about the Britain and Europe story over the next 5 or 6 years. And it's going to involve me going and interviewing all sorts of people who I've shouted at on the radio many times and who I probably don't want to meet, but I'm nevertheless going to have to brave myself and go and talk to them and try and understand where they were coming from. But let me advance a few hypotheses about why the Conservative Party swang in the way that it did. One of the key factors is clearly the seething resentment at grassroots level and amongst the younger members of the party about the way in which Europe had been the key issue over which the men in grey suits had persuaded Mrs. Thatcher to step down in 1990. That original sin, the fact that Europe was one of the things that had killed the Iron Lady, in a sense mattered much more for her children or the generation that had grown up in the party as she was when she was Prime Minister than it did for the men who did it. The immediate successor generation of Conservative MPs actually were quite glad to move away from Thatcher's legacy, but the party itself bitterly resented that original crime. A second, slower transformation has been the way in which I think the Conservatives have moved ever further away from the centre-right parties in the rest of Europe. Now, the Conservatives have never been a Christian Democrat party in the normal continental European mould, and links between the Conservatives and their European counterparts have never been particularly close. But there was, it's worth remembering, an important phase during the 1990s when Major tried very hard to bring the Conservatives into the European People's Party and the European Parliament and to forge links in that direction and to build much closer ties. Under the surface, however, I think that very period, the 1990s, and certainly the first years of the century, saw an opposite move at the cultural level amongst your conservative activists. And I now would argue that their international ties are much more with US republicanism than they are with continental right-of-centre politics. It's not a perfect match with US republicanism, but there's a much greater sort of sense of proximity to some of the discussions that are happening at grassroots level in the United States. And now this is partly a language thing, it's partly the effect of the internet, which means it's much easier for the Conservatives to join in discussions amongst conservative Americans. But I think US conservatism has become a much more important model, whereas European centre-right politics has become a much less important one. Third factor, which I think helps explain the Conservatives' shift, has been the growing perception amongst many Conservatives that Europe was the factor standing between them and a series of cherished policy aims. Now, this was true in the field of crime and punishment, the way in which sort of prisoners' rights and things were given by the European Court of Justice and others, or the European Court of Human Rights, and the two were always conflated, in a way that the Conservatives objected to, but also the way in which the European treaty stood between the Conservatives and bringing back capital punishment. So that was one area, but it's also the case in immigration policy. It's also the case in economic policy, trade union rights, other things, whereas Brussels was seen as a check, a break, something that stopped the Conservatives following the policy courses that they would have liked to do so. And then the final factor, which I think is there explaining the Conservatives' shift of position, was the electoral rise of UKIP. And over the last 5 to 10 years, a large number of Conservative MPs have become concerned about the success of UKIP in opinion polls, have become worried that their constituencies could swing to UKIP, or at least UKIP could split the Conservative vote and allow Labour or the Liberal Democrats to come to power instead. And therefore there's been pressure at Westminster level, but from Conservative MPs for the party as a whole to emulate UKIP's policies and to avoid that, to avoid being outflanked. The end result, though, is a party where anti-Europeanism has become one of the core ideological beliefs, especially at rank and file level and amongst the young activists. As a result, politicians like David Cameron, who wanted to maintain the long-standing Tory tradition of making policy in a pragmatic and relatively non-ideological fashion found themselves under constant attack from the Europhobes. And it was in a disastrous attempt to relieve this pressure once and for all that Cameron decided to hold the referendum in 2016. And I think it's also important, the switch of the Conservative Party, in understanding how the referendum campaign then unfolded. Because one of the things that had happened in 1975 was that the Yes campaign, as it was then called, so the remainers of that era, had managed successfully to persuade the public that the people standing on the opposite side of the debate were madmen, were the loonies from the political spectrum. And the fact that they came from the extreme right of the Conservative Party, the National Front, etc., and from the extreme left of the Labour Party meant, and indeed the Scottish nationalists, ironically, meant you could portray these as the wild men of British politics. Don't trust that lot. All the sensible people, Edward Heath, Mrs. Thatcher, Roy Jenkins, Harold Wilson, etc., are in the centre and they're on the side of yes. Now, Remain was not able to do that in 2016, partly because of the amount of the Conservative mainstream that went over to the Leave campaign. It was you could portray Farage as a loony, although he was quite a popular loony, but you couldn't, and you could just about portray Boris Johnson as a loony, probably justly. But given the number of Conservative heavyweights who were also part of that, part of the Leave campaign, it was much harder to dismiss them as a bunch of sort of zealots who just don't know what they're talking about. And I think that helped shift the momentum in their campaign quite a lot. So that's the first of my three proximate factors, the shift of the Conservative Party. The second of my proximate factors is the failure of the British to preserve a strong pro-European political camp. Now, here too there are multiple causes, and I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them, and I'm not sure I've identified all of them. I think the longest term factor, and quite an important one, is the failure of the British pro-Europeans to invent a central narrative to justify European integration, to replace the solution to Britain's decline story, which had been the original argument. If you go back to the 1960s and the 1970s, the big pro-European argument that the British pro-Europeans put forward was that Britain has been on a pattern of constant decline since the Second World War, and Europe is the medicine we need to take to stop that decline. That was the core argument. Right or wrong, you can dispute, but nevertheless, that was the argument that was put forward. Now, the problem with that argument is that one of Mrs. Thatcher's successes in the 1980s was to kill the decline narrative. Whether or not Britain has actually gone on declining is, again, an issue I don't want to discuss now, although I'm happy to touch upon that in discussion. But one of the things that Thatcher did was to break that decline spiral. And the British self-identification, which in the 1960s and 1970s had been about we are going down in the world, instead stopped being that. And once that decline narrative was broken, then Europe as the medicine to stop decline ceased to have any justification. And so that kind of punched a hole in the core pro-European case that has never really been replaced. There are other arguments the British pro-Europeans used, of course, but there's never been a single replacement, central argument to replace that medicine to stop decline argument once that ceased to apply. So that's the first problem. A second factor, don't worry, I've finished with that page, so I'll pick it up later. A second factor is the more recent collapse of the centre-left support for European integration. In the early days of the Conservatives' shift into a Europhobic position, the political significance of this was greatly tempered by the fact that at precisely the same time that the Conservatives were swinging away from Europe, the Labour Party was swinging back towards it. And you did therefore have a situation in the 1990s as the Conservative Party became ever more sceptical. The Labour Party had become a real bastion of pro-Europeanism. And I think you can say with some without too much fear of contradiction, that Tony Blair was probably the most pro-European British Prime Minister since Edward Heath. And so that kind of counterbalanced it. However, if you go forward into the 21st century, I think that left of centre, I hesitate to use the word left-wing when talking about New Labour, but that left of centre pro-Europeanism has also gone into decline. The first set of problems were encountered with the rows over the Iraq War. That was particularly, obviously, Blair's own popularity that was hit, but I think it affected the whole European argument as well. Secondly, the internal Labour rejection of New Labour, the culmination of which, of course, was the election of Corbyn as leader. But nevertheless, I think as Labour tried to move away from New Labour, pro-Europeanism was one of the things that was ditched. But I think the single most important factor in explaining the disillusionment of the centre-left with Europe was actually the after effects, or the Britain's outside perspective on the Eurozone crisis. The way in which, for a lot of the left and the centre-left in Britain, European integration became associated with both austerity and with being beastly to the Greeks. Anybody who's read The Guardian in the last 10 years will know what I mean. You cannot pick up The Guardian without reading a story which is basically how horrible Germany is to the Greeks. Now, again, I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of that issue and so on, but that is the way in which it has been portrayed. And I think what this meant is that the part of British opinion that was most solidly pro-European in the early years of the 21st century was made progressively more and more anti-European, or at least sceptical about Europe, by the Eurozone crisis and its perceived effects. And then the third ingredient in this decline of the pro-European voice has been the electoral destruction of the Liberal Democrats in the last general election. Now, in many ways, this was sort of said something deeply disillusioning about Liberal Democrat voters, because the Lib Dems had always stood for coalition government, and therefore to punish them for the realities of coalition government, namely the fact that they would have to subscribe to some policies that they were not fully part of, really doesn't say very much for the intelligence of their voters. But nevertheless, their voters deserted them in droves last election, and what had been quite a powerful pro-European voice was therefore almost entirely extinguished prior to the referendum campaign. But that all meant that when it came to the referendum campaign of 2016, there was a yawning gap where the pro-Europeans should have been. In 1975, Harold Wilson had been able to play quite a clever game of sitting on the fence, of describing himself as a kind of moderate skeptic who wasn't quite decided, because he knew he had other politicians on the pro-European side who he could rely upon to make the pro-European case. And so he was able to leave it to Edward Heath and to Roy Jenkins and people like that to make the pro-European case. He could sit on the fence, and then at the very last minute he could come off it. He always wanted to come off it this way, and he planned this, but nevertheless he was able to act that at the last minute he decided that the Yes campaign was more convincing, and so right in the kind of final weeks of the campaign he's able to say, oh, they've persuaded me, I'm going to vote yes. And he was able therefore to take a lot of equally wavering, sitting on the fence people with him as he did that. Cameron, I think, would have liked to have done the same thing. But he couldn't, because the problem in 2016 is that there was nobody where Heath and Jenkins had been. There was nobody on the pro-European side to make the pro-European case. And it therefore meant that Cameron and Osborne, neither of whom had particularly pro-European reputations, and both of whom actually had been pretty critical of the EU through much of their political careers, suddenly found themselves having to bang the European drum. And even in Cameron's case, try and make a speech about Europe as a peace project. And this is the same Prime Minister who couldn't even be bothered to go to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony the previous year. So it was deeply hypocritical and therefore not very convincing. But they had to do it because there was nobody where the pro-Europeans should have been to make the case for them. And it also meant that the pro-European case that was made could only be a relentlessly economic one. It could only really be Project Fear, because the people making it didn't have any European vision that they could put in the place of Project Fear, because they weren't fundamentally pro-European. So again, the loss of this pro-European component, I think, was really rather important. And then the final ingredient that I'll touch upon very briefly, and I'm conscious that time is running short, is the way in which the immigration factor was able to merge with the sovereignty argument in a particular potent way. Now, if you look at the Eurosceptic case in the 1970s, right the way through to 2016, for the Eurosceptics, the central argument has always been one about sovereignty. It's always been that Europe takes power away from the British Parliament, takes away from the British people and their capacity to decide. And you could more or less photocopy a speech that Tony Benn gives in 1976 and put it in the hands of Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage in 2016, and many of the arguments about sovereignty would be pretty much identical. The problem that the Eurosceptics used to have, however, is that whereas sovereignty gets most political wonks, sort of people who are really interested in politics, excited, for most of the general public, it's far too abstract a concept to get people very interested. And so this was one of the problems that the No campaign had in 1975. It would make these great speeches about sovereignty, and people would walk away going, so what? How does that affect my life? And in 1975, the No campaigners struggled to find anything that made loss of sovereignty real. In 2016, that changed, and it changed because of the immigration issue. It changed because of the immigration issue, because immigration became the classic example of how Britain was no longer able to decide for itself on something that was important to everyday people. And the fact that the Conservatives were unable to put a cap on Polish or Romanian or Bulgarian migrants because of EU laws. The fact that Cameron had gone away to Brussels to renegotiate that and had come back with a fairly pathetic emergency brake, which wasn't really likely to do very much. That became the very epitome of the loss of sovereignty argument. And so I think the immigration factor, which was not there at all in 1975, became something that was able to transform this largely theoretical danger of the loss of sovereignty into something that the ordinary voter in the street could understand, and that would therefore persuade him or her to cast their vote in a negative direction. So, to conclude, I don't think that the British I do think the British have had a problematic relationship with Europe since the outset. That's undeniable. And we can discuss in the Q&A whether that's because of sort of deep cultural factors, Britain being an island or whatever, or whether it's something to do with stiff upper lips or some other aspect of the British character or whatever. There were all sorts of potential causes for that. So there has been a problem from the very outset. But that problem was not enough to stop Britain actually playing its cards quite well in Brussels, being rather an influential and in many ways rather successful member state. And it wasn't enough to stop European integration having a transformative effect on both the British economy and the British society. It therefore took the incidence of three shorter-term factors to turn this fragile but nevertheless potentially enduring marriage into a Brexit outcome. And those three shorter-term factors were the move of the Conservative Party into a position of opposition, the disappearance of the pro-European case, and the way in which the sort of immigration factor merged with the sovereignty problem to transform the latter into something that people really felt was tangible and comprehensible, rather than the rather abstract notion that got political wonks excited but left most of the general public cold. And it's that coincidence between an underlying problem and these three shorter-term factors that I would argue at least explains why there was a referendum campaign in the first place, why the campaign was then so badly fought by the pro-Europeans, and why ultimately the referendum campaign was lost. But I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for this really comprehensive overview over the long history of a difficult relationship, and also on giving us insights in how the different debates developed in the UK. And I think what particularly struck me is that I, for a long time, had the impression that during the referendum campaign, there wasn't really any pro-European side anymore in the public debate in the UK. You rather had the anti-Europeans fighting against the Eurosceptics. And obviously, as you very well put it, the Eurosceptics weren't able to very convincingly argue why the UK should vote for staying inside this European Union that they criticized basically on a daily basis in the months and years beforehand. And before I give the floor to our guest, I would like to abuse my position and probe you a little bit more on what you think were the drivers and the actors behind the developments of sort of where at least I observe as a sort of political scientist that until or during the time of Tony Blair's premiership, the relationship had somewhat settled. In the sense that if you looked at the attitudes of Britons towards the European Union during the late 1990s and early 2000s, they weren't so different from the rest of the European Union. And then suddenly turned worse and worse in the last 10 years. And so my question after all that the different drivers that you went through, do you think it was more a case of the different identities and the different perception in the UK, where crises like the refugee crisis, the Euro crisis, just work different in the British public? Or do you rather see it as the choices of political actors, like a prominent Nigel Farage pushing the Conservative Party to become more Eurosceptic, like a British Prime Minister David Cameron, who always put party management, in my perception, before making the case for the European Union?
Well, I think I'm going to be slightly cowardly and say it was both, but say it was both the underlying attitudes and the personalities. I think the underlying attitudes, what's important is the way in which, for about 10, so if you go from the end of the long ratification battle over Maastricht, so mid-1990s, and the huge bloodletting in the Conservative Party over the European issue that happened in those years. It's not just Maastricht, it segues into BSC, but if you, so up until about 1995, 1996, you could not turn on British television news without hearing a story about a row over Europe within the Conservative Party. It was on the news every single day, etc. So it was very much at the forefront of British public, the British politics, and therefore it was constantly being dangled in front of the public, even if the public were on the whole largely bored by it. You then have a period where for about 10 years the issue was fairly successfully put to sleep. And New Labour, particularly once Blair loses the argument with Brown about Euro membership and decides therefore that he's not going to be able to persuade the British to join the single currency, the European issue just vanishes. And I have a sort of almost personal experience of this, in that I used to, when I first turned up at the LSE, I used to teach a course on Britain and Europe, looking at the historical origins of the problem. And in my early years there, so in the late 1990s, there was still, because the issue was still so recent, there was a generation of students who really wanted to understand the background to this stuff that had been on the news every single night and so on, and they used to sign up in their tens at least. You don't need more than 10 to 15 students to run a class in the LSE, but I used to get 10 to 20 students each year. As you moved into about 2004, 2005, 2006, numbers began to drop, and I don't think it was just my teaching which was getting worse, or that my hair was going grey and that they weren't signing, and that they didn't want to sign up to be taught by me. Perhaps I just had younger, more attractive colleagues, but I think it was actually it no longer was an issue that spoke to students. It was an issue that had gone to sleep, and so they weren't interested in the historical courses of it. That changed dramatically when the Conservatives come back into power and in the early years. And I think the thing that changes it, that brings it back into the forefront, is the Eurozone crisis, and the way in which this is portrayed as a sort of threat to the British economy. This is something that the British are preoccupied about, even if they're not directly involved in, and so on. So I think there is a sort of underlying thing. There is also a party management issue. One of the things that had happened to Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party is that because the Conservatives, so while the Conservatives were in power in the 1990s, in a sense the Eurosceptics could be kept in check by the realities of having to run the country. And so the Conservative Party is always a strange beast because it's concerned both about ideology, but it's also concerned about fairly pragmatic politics. When they were in power in the 1990s, there was a right old battle between those two sides, but the pragmatists more or less managed to prevail most of the time. The long period in opposition, well, Blair and then Brown were in power, led to a situation where you no longer have that pragmatic necessity to deal with it, and the ideological antipathy to Europe just festered and festered and festered. And it's like putting a sort of slightly mouldy piece of cheese in the back of a cupboard and leaving it for 3 or 4 years. When you bring it out, it's not very nice. Well, that was a bit what happened with Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party. You just go, yeah. And by the time Cameron came back to power in 2000s, and particularly once he had to start to engage with some genuine issues about then the ideological position in the party had just become almost unmanageable, which is why he had to then promise a referendum to try and solve the crisis.
Thank you very much. We already have a couple of questions, and there are more coming, so you certainly raised controversy. I would first start here and then go over to several of your colleagues.
Thank you very much for your rich talk, and despite it being rich, I would like to add a few things.
Sure.
You might want to include in your list of the awkward relationship. By the way, I'm a professor of law in Warwick, and since 29 years now, and I've lived through the same changes in the relationship between Europe and the UK. And actually, I'm teaching European Union law, and I was director of the European Studies program, so I saw the changes. Your last remarks on the changes in the student attitudes, I encountered as well, and there's more behind that. So it's less interest in studying in Europe, in the UK, and that needs to be explained. But what I want to add to your list of the awkward relationship is, which you left out, is the non-membership in the Schengen agreement. And which has a significant influence on and the whole question of traveling on the European continent is from my perspective, very important to explain the strange views of many British people of not having personal encounters, and the politics actually make it more difficult for them to do that. But then the question I have for you is another topic you left out in our discussion of the referendum. And that's what really surprised me during the referendum, that there were, of course, discussions of not just destroying the European Union, but destroying the United Kingdom, the regional question.
Yes.
So the pro-European attitudes in Northern Ireland and in Scotland in particular. A special case you need to explain is, of course, Wales, that benefit so much from the European Union, more than the rest of the regions in the UK, but voted against staying in the European Union. Now, this question of this referendum not just destroying the link with the European Union, but also threatening the Union in the United Kingdom, actually didn't have that much influence. So that's a question to you: why this didn't have more sort of weight?
I would collect one more question, and so that we can bring them together first.
Just up to now, I do not quite understand why particularly the immigration questions played as far as I can see, more or less decisive role in the whole processes. Britain being the European country with the longest tradition of immigration from the Commonwealth, of course. Well, Germany has never got these problems. Our surrounding countries, more or less, no exception may be Belgium and France. France is a particular case with all these Moroccan-speaking suburbs around the big cities, and they handle it very, very badly. But the English should have had more nervous.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Can I? Well, that's the two very good questions. That last one is very useful because I slightly cut my immigration section because I was conscious about the time.
One more point. Or is it the feeling that the boat is full now?
Well, okay. Okay, let me go back to the regional effects. Well, just very quickly so Schengen, I agree psychologically. I don't think the British have a clue, sort of about. So the British do travel in Europe, but of course they always go backwards and forwards without going between countries, and therefore so I live partly in Belgium, etc. So I'm quite used to crossing European borders without showing my passport. I would sit at the back of a passport queue, getting ever more annoyed at the fact that I was having to show my passport. Most of the British tourists had to do that always, and never realised that the rest of Europe was any different, because they would go to Italy, they would go to France, but they would never go from Italy to France. They would always go to the sort of the cramped little bit of the airport where there was still the passport control, etc. So I think Schengen is quite important. To that I would also add languages. So the British have never been good at languages, but the decline in knowledge of languages, and therefore the inability to any longer just have any cultural link with or follow to any extent at all the political developments in neighbouring countries was quite important. And one of the factors that may be there in that argument I made about the shift from towards the Republican Party is I think the internet has increased this, because if you type something into Google, you will type it in English and you will get an English website, but it may well actually be an American website or a New Zealand website rather than a much more relevant example, which might be in French, but if you don't type it in French in Google, you're not going to get or whatever. So I think the decline of languages has been quite important. The non-effect of the... So I agree. I was an optimist going in. I was pessimist a long time before the referendum and when it was being talked about, and I thought, so this is a very dangerous policy. But I persuaded myself during the awful campaign that it would probably just about turn out okay. And one of the arguments I used most strongly to myself to do that was precisely that I thought in the end the fear of the regional disintegration would prove decisive, and it would scare enough people into voting Remain, albeit with a heavy heart. I think the reason that didn't happen ultimately has a lot to do with the reason why I actually think in the next 10 to 20 years we are going to see the breakup of the UK, namely the increasingly diverging political cultures between England and Scotland. Most people in England do not have a clue what the Scots think, and most of the people in Scotland do not have much of a clue what the English think. And we are talking about increasingly diverging political cultures, and therefore I just do not believe that most people south of the border knew anything about or cared very much about the very different debate that was happening in Scotland. And so, again, the political elite knew about it, but I think most voters just were not interested and were not aware of that dimension. And so I think that is why ultimately it turned out to be a much less relevant issue than I had anticipated that it would be. On immigration, you're right, of course, the British have a tradition of immigration that goes a long way back. It is, of course, a tradition of immigration that has been contested. But, of course, the contestation was always separate from the debate about Europe, because immigration into Britain until 2004 was overwhelmingly non-European immigration. It was from the Indian subcontinent, by and large, to a certain extent from the West Indies and Africa, but hardly at all from continental Europe. And so if you were anti-immigration, and there were people who were anti-immigration, this did not in any way link with the European debate. You could be pro-European and anti-immigration, and you could be pro-immigration and anti-European. They were the independent variables in a way, they didn't link. What changes after 2004 is that the very large-scale influx, initially from Poland, subsequently from Romania and Bulgaria, led to a conflation of the European issue and the immigration issue in a way that had not previously existed. And so this, And this was important because it gave people who really didn't care very much about the abstract notion of Europe, and for whom Europe was a long distant place they didn't visit, they didn't do business with, they didn't have anything to do with, it suddenly brought it down to their level because it became the reason why the flat next door is occupied by people we can't talk to. And so it kind of made it a much more, and one of the things about the referendum campaign is a lot of people voted in 2016 who had not voted for years. They just hadn't bothered to vote. They were disengaged from the political process. But immigration became an issue that actually brought them out of their isolation. And most of those who had not voted for years, when they did vote, voted leave. And given the proximity of the result, you can explain a lot of the result by that kind of revolt of the politically discontented, and that had a lot to do with immigration. So it was a very, very important factor, even if it was, I agree, a surprising factor in a sense, given the fact that Britain had been a country of high immigration. Can I add one further point about immigration, which is, I find, deeply ironic? Namely that it is actually also an issue where the British paid, well, if you view the outcome of the referendum in a negative way, which I do, the British paid a price for some of their supposed exceptionalism and dislike of identity cards and sort of continental ways of controlling the population. Because one of the reasons why immigration in Britain, and particularly the short-term spike in Polish, Romanian and Bulgarian immigration, was so socially disruptive, was that the British government hadn't a clue where the people went. And therefore money and resources could not follow the population. The British do not know how many Poles and Bulgarians and Romanians there are in Britain because they don't have to have identity cards, they don't have to declare their presence to the local council, etc. And you therefore did get certain areas that had a genuine problem because you would suddenly get a school that discovered that there were sort of 50 new kids who needed to be given year 9 education who were from Poland, Hungary and Romania and who didn't have very much English. And there was no additional government money that to follow those people because the government didn't know where they were. And so there was a genuine problem, but it had to do with the way in which the British organised government spending and have this fixation about avoiding identity cards at all costs because these are this is some sort of police state system which the British disliked.
So it was not as much the refugee problem.
No, it's not. No, it wasn't. So it became conflated, but it wasn't really refugees. It was much more. It was about resources not following local migrants, and so hospitals were being overwhelmed, council houses were being used up, etc., etc. Now, a lot of it is actually to do with underspending of public money and therefore not enough places in hospital or not enough school places and not enough social housing, etc. But the shortages got blamed on the sudden influxes of migrants, particularly from Eastern Europe, and so that merged with the European issue.
Yeah. And one comment from my side, as the UK is not in Schengen, they weren't actually in any way affected by the relocation scheme or the large influx of refugees during the refugee crisis in 2015.
I think we managed to take 390 Syrians.
Yeah. But still there were posters from UKIP where there was a long row of Syrian refugees with the heading "Breaking Point," trying to conflict the two issues. But we have several more questions. I would start next with the two at the back over there, and then go over to you. So.
I'd just like to take up an argument that's been bandied around here quite a lot, that the referendum wasn't really something about the EU, but an attack on the elite and the feeling that we've gotten an opportunity to bash those people in London who represent Europe in some sort of way on the head, and we take this opportunity and do it.
Should we collect some?
Yeah, one more.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. One brief remark on immigration. I mean, one could argue that this long-standing resentment against immigration could be tapped and was possibly tapped by the Brexiteers, because I mean, there has been a long-standing resentment against immigration. I mean, if you think about, Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, 68, the campaign against the Kenyan immigrants, 73, Margaret Thatcher mentioning Britain was being swamped by immigrants in the 1979 campaign. So, I mean, would be interesting, to investigate, but to what extent this long-standing anti-immigration resentments were tapped in the referendum campaign. But my question is really, one could approach the issue by looking for turns, crucial periods of transformation, when the balance turned. With regard to domestic politics, I think 1978, 79 was quite crucial. The winter of discontent, the disillusionment about the economic promises, of joining the European Union, stopping the economic decline, the ruling of the European Court on Human Rights on Ireland's case against torture against Britain. 78, I think. So 78, 79 seems to have been some turning point in this relationship. But it would be even more interesting to broaden the perspective and ask for turning points in this dynamic interrelationship between Britain and the other European member states. Do you think there were some stages, some crucial decisions that could have been taken differently and could have helped to keep Britain in the European Union or in the European Economic Community?
Okay.
Of course, it's a danger of counterfactual history, of course, but sometimes it's I think, useful to look for alternatives.
And certainly one question, if I can add to that, that's asked in Brussels is, could there have been something different given to Cameron that he could have used to actually win the referendum against a party that was already largely Eurosceptic or anti-European?
Yeah. Okay, several issues there. Just going back to the immigration issue. No, hold on. The referendum is anti-elite and sort of bash. Yes, I think there is that factor in any referendum. It's the nature of referendum campaigns that some people will always use them to just protest against the leaders of the moment. And there was certainly that vote, and if you followed discussions between disappointed Remainers in the weeks and months after the referendum campaign, one of the things that we all did was we swapped anecdotes about the totally irrelevant grounds on which some people had supposedly cast their votes. So sort of the little old lady who'd supposedly voted leave because her local council would close the public toilets in her park and or no longer swept the grass, swept the leaves on the paths and so on. So it's clear that some people did cast their vote because they just were sick of politicians, were sick with the government and so on. The reason, so what made this perhaps slightly different, or the way in which I would sort of relate your question to my talk, is I think that accentuated the problem of Cameron being the principal pro-European spokesman. I think if you'd had a situation in which the pro-European case was being made by a wide variety of politicians and indeed business leaders and church leaders and other figures who might command some kind of respect, the temptation to sort of bash the government by voting leave would have been diminished. But the fact that you get this very close association between the Prime Minister of the moment and a Chancellor who is regarded as personally responsible for austerity measures and the Remain case, I think does increase the desire on the part of certain people to just punish those people even if they don't care very much about Europe. But so I think there is that factor, but whether it was fundamentally different from all referendums, I don't really know. The point about the long-standing nature of immigration, I entirely agree. It is an issue that has been controversial in British politics for a very long time, but it is important to note that it wasn't a European factor until 2004, because it wasn't. If you complained about anti-immigration, you were complaining about West Indians, you were complaining about Pakistanis, you were complaining about Bangladeshis, you were not complaining about Europeans, because European migration was much lower. It's only in the years immediately preceding, it's the combination of the 2004 enlargement plus the effects of the Eurozone crisis, which increased migration from places like Spain, etc., that you suddenly get a series of years where migration from the remainder of the EU was actually higher than migration from outside the EU. It was still only about 52-53%, sort of, so there was as much immigration coming in from elsewhere. But that would not have been, if you'd gone back to sort of 1985, migration would have been 80%, 90% from outside of the Europe, and therefore it was irrelevant for the European debate. The one thing that is important, I think, is that actually that broadening of migration allows you to make an anti-migration case without being overtly racist. And I think this is actually quite important in the British debate. One of the reasons why people could not jump on the Enoch Powell bandwagon was that to do so was to be clearly racist. If you were anti-immigration in Britain in the 1970s or 80s, you were being anti-black. And for a huge number of educated Britons, that's a position that is almost impossible to take. One of the bizarre things about the large-scale EU migration of the early years of this century was that it actually allowed people to say that, I'm not being discriminatory here on terms of race. I just don't like the idea of more people coming into a crowded country. And so it became a kind of non-racially specific thing, which was actually politically easier to make. It doesn't mean that there weren't racist undertones to it. There were, as the poster you referred to highlighted. But actually, I think quite a lot of people found themselves able to voice an anti-immigrant sentiment when it applied to Poles or to Romanians, which they wouldn't dare make about Jamaicans or Pakistanis or whatever. So that's quite interesting in itself. Turning point. 78, 79 I think is crucial, but it's too long ago. So if you're trying to explain the sort of, after all, sort of the heyday of the period I'm talking about where Britain does engage with the process comes after 78, 79. So I don't think that's enough. The cases you mention are a further example of how there was an endemic level of political dissatisfaction with Europe the whole way through. But I'm not certain I would really fasten on that period as a key turning point. Where did it go wrong in the sort of shorter term? Well, you could, given the stress that I put on immigration, point to 2004 and the decision not to apply for the sort of transitional arrangements on migration, things that Germany and other countries adopted. You could point to Cameron's decision to hold a referendum. Now, it's worth pointing out, it's worth remembering, Cameron's Bloomberg speech, where he promises a referendum, is made at a time when he is in coalition government with the Lib Dems, who we know will prevent him from holding that referendum, and it's made in the expectation that the next general election will lead to a further coalition government. And therefore, this is a promise that he can make, diffuse some of the tension within his own party by making, but never have to honour. And in that respect, therefore, the last general election becomes a crucial turning point, because it's the surprise outcome of a Conservative victory, which means that the Conservatives can govern on their own without the Lib Dems, which means that the Cameron now has to deliver on this referendum pledge that he previously hadn't. He previously hadn't thought he would have to. So you can point to that as a crucial turning point. Could he have been given more in the renegotiation? Well, wearing my EU expert hat, no, because it was too much in contradiction with fundamental principles of the single market. Could he have been given a few more baubles, etc.? Perhaps. But I don't. The 74-75 manoeuvre that Wilson carried out relied upon having a largely pro-European British press that could report the renegotiation that Wilson carried out as a major triumph. It wasn't. It was a farce. But it was presented to the British public as a success. Cameron's manoeuvre to attempt to do the same in 2015-16 was doomed because the British press is rabidly anti-European now, and it was never going to allow. Even if he had been given more, it would have been dismissed as insignificant. So I don't think it was. I think it was a folly to try it, but I don't think just if he'd been given a little bit more, it would have been different.
Thank you. I think I'm going to allow one last round of questions, starting over there.
I've been waiting very patiently, like
Yeah,
an Englishman
thank
at a
you.
bus stop. So this gives me the right to ask two questions. The first is about Scotland, which you mentioned in the discussion, but only really mentioned in passing in the talk itself.
Yeah.
And you mentioned specifically the Scottish nationalists,
Yeah.
saying that they were anti-European in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And now, of course,
Yeah.
Nicola Sturgeon is probably the most prominent pro-European voice in the UK, and one of the most prominent in the EU, I would argue. How come?
Okay.
And the second question is an invitation to speculate.
There you go.
So, after the imminent breakup of Britain, given that the younger vote was overwhelmingly pro-EU, do you think that that demographic trend will be strong enough in England for England to apply to rejoin the European Union after the breakup?
Very good questions. Oh.
Don't worry.
The result was very knapp, it is in German. Was very not much difference between remain and leave, as I know from the newspapers. And those who demonstrated against leave were young people. So it fits to that what you say. We saw it in the TV. And I think much of what you said this evening and the other people here was, I start with another point. If many people in England said if they would have known the result, they would have gone to elect. The Wahlbeteiligung was very
Turnout, yeah.
little, so 50% or so, or a little bit more.
No, it was very high actually. It was much higher. It was 70 or 80%.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, the turnout was high.
It was so.
It was
but
higher than any general election.
But for leave, the votes for leave were not much more than 50% from those who voted. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
52%.
It was 48.
Yeah, this is ganz. So, that's speculating again. If all British people would have gone, that would have been another result. I mean, that's what the media say.
Yeah.
And so I think the same what you said, maybe in 10 or 20 years, the young people vote for rejoin.
Thank you.
Bitte?
So,
Ja, that's right. Was nun anders die Älteren, die für die die merken aber jetzt, was ihnen fehlt.
You also mentioned the domestic issues which led to the referendum in the first place and the outcome of it. And very often when I read in like German newspapers, I had a feeling when a lot of issues talked about they're actually British domestic issues. But Cameron tried to, well, let's put it this way, save his own skin, trying to defend himself against the very right-wing parts of his party by going into a referendum and then wasn't able to call in the demons, what he called.
Yeah.
So my question is, how much of this problem is actually a little bit in the British voting system? Because in your voting system, you basically force two major parties to swap in between. So it's very, very hard for example, like the Liberal Democrats to gain a vote. So you cannot really split your two major parties to accept more differentiated views. You force them into one block, and then this one bloc has to cooperate, and if it doesn't work, you're suddenly coming up to, as you point out in this wonderful picture of a moldy cheese, you might force them into a direction which might not be might not cover the majority of the opinion and of the people otherwise.
Yeah.
So how much has the voting system actually to do with the outcome?
Okay, thank you. I think the last question, if you're not overwhelmed,
okay.
belongs to the organizer.
Whether I can read my own notes is another matter. But
Well, thanks very much, Piers. I'd like to pick up on a point you made about opt-outs.
yes.
It was quite intriguing. You described them in ambiguous terms. On the one hand, indicating the difficulty of the relationship over time. Also, many opt-outs have been negotiated over these years of membership. But at the same time, you said they testify to the strength of the negotiation position in a sense, because you have to find allies to actually accept this opt-out.
Yes.
Might there also be something like the culture of the opt-out that may help to explain some of the Brexit discussions in the referendum, or the absence of discussions, more likely? What is striking was the absence of any thorough assessment of what a possible post-Brexit arrangement would look like, or which one is realistic in the sense of being negotiable with the Europeans at all. So, in the sense, was there maybe the culture of the opt-out as the maximum, the ultimate opt-out of everything but the single market access? Because that was flouted in some way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, well that's quite a. So I've got a whole new talk to give here in terms of, but I don't want to keep you all night. Scotland, very quickly. The Scottish nationalists changed their position. So the key shift seems to have been in the 1970s, the perception, the two main grounds for Scottish nationalist dislike of Brussels was firstly the idea that if power was centralised in Brussels, this would make the position of peripheral regions like Scotland even more remote and even more traumatic than it already was, and so they feared real marginalisation. And the second argument was that Brussels would prevent some of the sort of very left-wing economic policies they wanted to implement. The thing that changes the position dramatically for Scotland is 12 years, or in fact, if you count major, 20 years, sort of nearly 20 years of Conservative rule. Because from 1979 through to 1997, you have constant Conservative rule. Scottish voters go to the polls every single election and vote for a majority of Labour MPs, and yet they get a Tory government. And Brussels, therefore, over the 1980s, gradually began to be seen as a protection against London rather than as a menace to the few things that Edinburgh could do. And so Brussels began to be seen as a sort of shield which you could use to preserve some workers' rights and to preserve various things that you thought were worthwhile against a rabidly right-wing majority in England. And so I think that's one of the key things that helps swing there were doubtless other things going on as well, but I think that's probably the single sort of simplest factor. Will the British rejoin? Well, my parents in the English. My parents are already teasing my elder daughter that she is going to be the Prime Minister who will bring Britain back into the EU when in 25 years' time. I'm not quite certain I want that to happen for many reasons, but to my daughter. But nevertheless, I think it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. Having said that, if I am right in my other prediction, namely that I think that you could well have a breakup of the UK. If that happens, it will make it even harder for the English to then rejoin, because sort of the result, to go back to your question, was tight. It was sort of basically a 3% margin, so it could have, in a sense, been shifted quite quickly. If you take the Scots and the Northern Irish out of the picture, then the English and Welsh voted by a much clearer margin to to leave. And so to reverse that, you will take much more. It is true that if you look at the young, they voted on the whole differently, but the young won't be always young, and it depends. Are they voting differently because they're young, in which case in 20 years' time they won't be any longer and they will vote in a different way, or are they voting differently because they have somehow had a different set of experiences which mean that they view the world different, or they're better educated, or whatever. It's very difficult to disentangle all of those factors. I'm not terribly optimistic, to be honest. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it will certainly take 15 to 20 years, and for that to happen you will need to have the British to have a fairly bumpy post-Brexit economic ride, which I don't think is at all impossible, but you also will need to have, and this is perhaps also slightly improbable, you will need to have a run of very good luck stories coming out of Brussels and coming out of the continent. So you can't just have a successful German economy and a successful Swedish economy and things like that. You're going to have the French, the Italians and Spanish turning themselves around and succeeding as well. If you go back to a picture where the 27 are systematically growing faster than the British or the English as they perhaps would have become, well, in 10, 15 years anything's possible. If you don't, and if you continue to have problems in the EU, I'm not certain the British are going to change their mind anytime soon. Which brings me partly to your question about the voting system. I actually I struggle to link the voting system to the Brexit outcome. I do think the rigidities of the voting system are something that are fundamental now. Because if you, so the next general election, which we now know is only a few weeks away, is in a sense going to be a profoundly false election, because you're going to have a lot of Remainers who are going to end up voting for the Conservatives because they can't go with Corbyn's Labour and the Lib Dems aren't powerful. So Europe is going to be one of the big issues, and yet there is no party which really maps onto the Remain-Leave divide. And yet you could argue that Britain is now ripe for a major political realignment, where you would get basically the pro-European remaining sliver of the Conservative Party, the Lib Dems and the pro-European Labour people would sort of form one party, and then on the other side you'd have the Europhobes in the Conservative Party, etc. And that would be a much more logical arrangement. But to get there, you have to overcome this problem about a party political system that penalises people who split parties, and which only really ever returns one of two parties. And that's a major obstacle. There are a lot of people who, in a sense, would like a political realignment in Britain, but getting there with our current electoral system is almost impossible. And so it's very difficult to see how that might come about. Point about very quickly on the turnout. It was a very high turnout, and although the result was close, I think the pattern, particularly in England, was sufficiently clear-cut for it to be difficult to sort of dismiss as an accident. It clearly reflected something serious. It did, though, and this links with Martin's question, it did reflect a profoundly inadequate campaign where not only had you had no adequate pro-European case made, but you also had wildly dishonest and unrealistic pictures portrayed of what life without the EU would be. Now, again, to a certain extent, that is always the case with a referendum. If you reduce politics to a yes-no answer, you are bound to have a sort of built-in dishonesty, which is why I'm personally contrary to referendums on anything. So it's partly in the nature of the beast, but it's also the case that the British, partly because of the general level of ignorance about Europe, but partly also because of the balance of the media, had a situation where certain absolutely manifest lies were never challenged. So the Leave campaigners admitted that the sum that they put on the side of their famous bus was wrong because it didn't take into account the rebate. So it was exaggerated by 25 to 30%. They conceded that, and yet they still drove around with that bus, and that figure was still used in speech after speech after speech, despite the fact that they admitted it was a lie. Likewise, they were able to sort of go on talking about having basically membership of the single market while leaving the... So I think it's not so much the opt-out culture, but it's the result of a political culture where people knew so little about Europe that the journalists who were posing the questions, the interviewers who were trying to sort of put politicians on the spot, weren't able to sort of nail dissimulation and falsehood in the way that you would if you were discussing the National Health Service or you were discussing education or whatever. And I'm constantly appalled. My wife will testify to this. Sort of I wake up each morning and turn on the radio and start shouting at the radio because the standard of interviewing questions on Europe just reveals a level of ignorance about European issues that you just could not get away with as a political journalist on any domestic issue. So people who make the most elementary mistakes and sort of say the Council of Ministers when they mean the European Council, or get the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights mixed up, all sorts of very sort of pretty, easy enough for a student in the first year of class to make, but you don't expect a seasoned political journalist to make that, and yet they make it all the time. And so there is, I think, a level of, it's not so much the opt-out culture, but the sort of the systematically not learning about Europe culture that I think underpinned quite a lot of the falsehoods in the campaign.
Well, thank you very much. Let me say a couple of last words. You really showed that as a Brit you have an exceptional knowledge of EU affairs, and I certainly, as somebody who works daily on Brexit, still learned a lot tonight, so I thank you very much. And I think you secondly also showed how important it is to, despite Brexit, keep up the personal and academic links between the UK and the continent, and I think it's very important that despite the UK leaving the European Union, we keep up these links and continue to work together and learn very much, so that at least some hopes are not in vain. Even if the UK doesn't rejoin the European Union, at least it remains a close partner that we can work with. And maybe one last point from me, I think for everybody who came here today, I think you saw a really excellent example from a very pro-European Brit. But I think to understand the Brexit debate, what I can also call upon you, if you're interested, is that it can sometimes be helpful to look exactly at the hostile British press towards the European Union, because I think only that is the key to understanding why the debate in the UK is so different on Europe and is sometimes not comparable at all to our domestic debate, and helps us understanding what the Brits are thinking about Europe and how we can negotiate with them about our future relationship. And with that, I thank you very much, also to the organizers, and I think there's still some wine and some cheesecakes or steaks downstairs. Thank you.